What if I told you one of the best guitarists alive might be completely wrong about why Eddie Van Halen changed music forever? Let's listen in here to something that Joe Bonamassa had to say about Eddie Van Halen's impact. Here's Joe speaking right here.
Imagine if the same Eddie Van Halen shows up with a knurl and a sir. Is it as cool? But I mean, I just posed the question.
Objectively not as cool, I would say.
All things being equal. Same playing, same songs. But when we sat down, people hear with their eyes.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing.
Bonamassa's point is very interesting. Eddie built his sound from scratch. He modded his own amps, he built his own guitars, he created his own pickups through trial and error. His struggle for innovation is part of his myth, and Bonamassa argues that if Eddie had just plugged into modern, ready-made gear, some of that cool factor would disappear. And on the surface, that sounds right. But here's the problem. It assumes that the gear is what made Eddie Van Halen matter. Let's listen into something that Eddie Van Halen himself had to say about his use of gear.
I've never used or owned any distortion pedal.
Right.
Nothing, you know. I always use the guitar, cable, straight to the amp. A lot of people, until they actually play my guitar through one of my amps, then they go, holy shit.
Basically what Ed's saying there is that he tried to minimize his use of gear. He made a point of stating that he wasn't relying on gear. He was trying to do what he could do through a basic direct plug into the amp setup. Now add to this the fact that most people listening to Van Halen in 1978 didn't know and still don't know what gear Eddie used. They didn't hear the variac or phase shifter. They heard his tapping, his soloing, his rhythm work, his songwriting, and it didn't sound like anything else on earth. So here's the question that breaks this whole debate wide open, at least in my opinion. If Eddie sounded exactly the same, would anyone care how he got that sound? Because that's where this discussion really gets interesting. Eddie himself actually tried to avoid relying on effects. He wasn't chasing gear, he was chasing feel and tone. His entire approach was about touch, timing, attack, rhythm. In other words, everything you can't put into a pedal. Think about what made Eddie explode into the culture. It wasn't just gear, it wasn't just his modding of guitars and amps, it wasn't just the tone. It was the way he thought about guitar, it was the way he played through the guitar, it was the way his personality came through, the swing, the looseness, the aggression, the joy, all of which could be replicated on any kind of guitar setup. That's why something like Eruption didn't just sound like a piece of gear or a technique, it sounded alive, it had purpose, it had vision, and that has nothing to do with whether the gear was homemade or factory built. So, what is Bonamassa really getting at here? Well, he's not wrong about one thing. The story of Eddie Van Halen is much cooler because he built and discovered his own gear. This is part of the myth and part of the legend, and I love it. But here's the distinction I want to make. The myth makes Eddie interesting, but the music is what made him unavoidable and unrepeatable. Think about modern artists. They have all the gear in the world. So, would Eddie Van Halen have been less cool with modern gear? Well, maybe the story of his history would be slightly less interesting. But the impact, no change, not a chance. Because what people connected to wasn't the technology behind the sound. It was the human being using the guitar, expressing through the guitar, and living inside of the music. And that's the part that no piece of gear, past or present, will ever be able to replicate or replace. So let me know what you think. Do you agree with Joe Bonamassa here, or do you think that Ed would have maintained his same level of coolness no matter what era he found himself in? Let's hear your take in the comments below. Jimmy Page almost never talks about modern rock bands. He doesn't endorse them, he doesn't anoint them as the future. He definitely doesn't show up to hype them. So when Jimmy Page quietly took notice of Bandmate in Tokyo in 2016, it wasn't a publicity moment, it was something much more rare. It was a